you're listening to this podcast, chances are you've felt the heartbreaking impact of trauma and abuse in your own story, or in the stories of those you care about. The truth is, we all carry the weight of personal and collective trauma. It's part of living in this world. And yet, we also know we were made for more. We were made for connection, wholeness, and a life marked by faith, hope, and love. If you desire more for yourself, for the people you love, and for your community, I want to personally invite you into narrative-focused trauma care training with us here at the Allender Center. Narrative-focused trauma care, or NFTC for short, is a methodology developed by the Allender Center and built on the lifelong work of Dr. Dan Allender in the field of trauma and abuse recovery. It brings together psychology and theology to give you a holistic framework as you enter into your story and the stories of those around you with wisdom and care. It begins with NFTC Level 1. Throughout 4 intensive training weekends, you'll receive foundational teaching from our team. But this isn't just theory. You'll also roll up your sleeves and enter into your own story, because as Dan says, we cannot take anyone further than we've been willing to go ourselves. In small groups with a trained facilitator, you'll actually participate in the work of story engagement, sharing your story and learning to listen well to the stories of others. Whether you're a therapist, ministry leader, or simply someone longing for deeper personal healing, this training invites you into a process of exploring your story, naming both your pain and your goodness, and growing in your capacity to love and lead well. Applications for NFTC Level 1 are now open. If you're ready to begin the journey toward deeper healing in your own story and a renewed calling to bring compassion, courage, and hope to the world around you, we invite you to visit theallendercenter.org/trainings.
Thank you for listening to the Allender Center Podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Rachel, we've been asked many times to address the issue of neurodivergence. And let's just start with just what an important topic this is. We'll get into some of the details, the practicalities, the percentages. But let's just say that when we're talking about difference, it just evokes so many things in people's hearts and minds. The question of, am I neurodivergent? What does it mean if my son or daughter or my spouse or a dear friend is neurodivergent? It's a phrase that's been developed since the 1990s and has really helped those of us who work with human beings to see that there are differences. Oh, what a simple phrase. Differences in the way that we metabolize reality, how we look at our own inner world and how we engage the social cues of others. So we've got a really phenomenal human being, Stephanie Isbell. Thank you for joining us. Stephanie is a therapist in the lovely and glorious state of Montana, who works uniquely with folks who are neurodivergent, but also has been through our narrative-focused trauma care process, and therefore brings the interplay of story and the processes of uniquely dealing with, quote-unquote, the word difference. So, Stephanie, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm really thrilled to do this. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, before we jump into what is neurodivergent and all the implications that will have for us to better understand the uniqueness of the world and the God who made us, I just want to sort of begin with letting our audience know, now, wait a minute, who are you? How did you get to where you are? I know it's broad and could take us literally the entire time, but just to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. I am a
sort of Johnny-come-lately counselor. This is my third career. But I started as an intern with a marvelous therapist who works with neurodivergent kids and learned the DIR model, which for counselors especially, we're looking at what's underneath for people, what really makes human beings what they are, which wraps in a lot of physiological variables as well as really early social. Um, and I have come through the NFTC training and various other things to work with adults who have new diagnoses of autism or ADHD, or they are parents who have neurodivergent kids. And I do use narrative therapy and NFTC in specific alongside this knowledge of what's underneath the underneath.
Before we go much further, talk to us about what you mean when you talk about just the broad category of neurodiversity.
Mm. Well, neurodiversity should just tell us, the more we learn about it, how broad and deep and wide the category of humanity. Um, right? So when we say divergent, we're very Western. So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of neurodevelopmental variables all stacked into one thing, if that's possible. And we call it something like autism spectrum disorder, which isn't really a thing. In the sense that every neurodivergent person is very, very different from another one. And they are more different from each other often than we are from each other, we normies, as they call us. So neurodivergence, in a Western sense, is someone who has characteristics that are more than 2 standard deviations from the norm. If you,
Wow.
yeah, right? It doesn't even make sense. But on a more personal level, these are people who have notable differences, usually in their sensory motor um, experience of the world and how they behave in relation to that. And more particularly in the way that they manage or can manage social relationships. So that would be my categories that we're looking at.
And we normally think about the autism spectrum disorder, but when we're talking about neurodivergence, we can also talk about folks who have ADD or ADHD, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that includes dyslexia,
Mhm.
dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and again, the reason I want to make sure is that given the reality that I have some degree of dyspraxia, I have significant degrees of dyscalculia, which is the inability to easily make numbers make sense, math make sense. Dyspraxia, the inability or the struggle with regard to planning, coordination, movement, practical tasks that most people seem to have. Further, not to make this about me, but I have been by good friends who work within this field, the idea of what's called hyper focus ADHD or ADD. So the reality is approximately about 15% of humanity fits broadly within this term of neurodiversity. But it's really intriguing, though I know all that about myself. I would, even prior to this podcast, I would never call myself neurodivergent. So it's
Well,
one
you
of
missed
those.
one, Dan. You missed one. High or low intelligence is also a neurodivergence.
Oh, I fall somewhere between those two extremes. So when we begin to address this, let me just underscore, I'm a pretty bright man. And literally up until this moment, even though I had all the data, the 2+2, the 2+2, still, if somebody had asked me prior to having you on today whether I was neurodivergent, no, absolutely not. Right, Rachel?
I'm not answering this question.
Wise. Because the underneath of the underneath, just to like put a circle around this so we understand what we're talking about, is all the physiological variables that all these capacities that infants are born with. They have to do with our management of sensory input, the thresholds beyond which we can detect it or are overwhelmed by it, the integration of those sensory inputs, motor planning and praxis, as you mentioned, sensory motor integration, our ability to regulate all of that and modulate it. We don't even think about this as counselors, but this is what a human being is when they're born.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow. Well, no, I think, you know, I would be so curious from you in your work. There are certain aspects of like our narrative focused trauma care training that I'm sure work really well, and certain aspects that maybe don't or have to be like contextualized when working with neurodivergence. And I would just, for as a clinician working with folks who are neurodivergent, what are some of those nuances or differences that have to be taken seriously, and need to actually be skills that are developed in order to be not just more helpful to someone, but actually more kind?
Yeah. So, especially my autistic clients have taught me a lot about this. Um, uh, we have to turn on and turn off some things. Often, especially people who have new diagnoses when they're older or they don't want a diagnosis, that's a thing too. Um, we have to do a couple of things because our empathy as counselors depends on our neurology being similar to our clients.
Oh,
And that is
okay. Say
not
that again. Say that again, because I think that's really important. Yeah.
because of the way our empathy works by feedback, facial affect, and so forth. Our empathy depends on us having similar neurology to our client. And so when a client like this sits down in your office, remind yourself, this person is not the same as me. So turn your empathy way down, put it on idle, put your attunement on high and your curiosity on high. So
Hmm.
it's a very different stance, right? I am learning about this very different entity over here. It's super fascinating. And stay there because they also have trouble reading you. So if you rely on empathy, it's not going to work well until you know them well. And every single person like this who sits in your office is a very different person. So be careful not to think, oh, I've worked with someone like this before. There'll be similarities, but also differences. So that's one of the main points. The other one is, and this is equally important, the kind of developmental trauma that someone with autism or ADHD or whatever neurodivergence they have, actually, because this is a very broad category. Um, if if you don't understand the specifics of their developmental trauma, you're going to make some mistakes. So what I will tell you is that trauma involves something beyond what we call just a usual, like, complex PTSD, for example. It goes beyond what we call like a racial and cultural trauma. And the reason for that is the universe and their particular culture that they're in and their family that they're in, the people that are their parents, all are telling them the same things about themselves. That consistent telling of who they are creates another level of trauma because the miscues between all of those people, especially their parents and them, start at infancy. An infant
Hmm.
who, for example, has a sensory processing disorder and perhaps has a sensory threshold problem, these are just examples, will maybe cue their mother, I don't like to be touched, when actually they do want to be touched, but in a different way. So mom says, oh, they don't like to be touched and puts them down. Uh-oh. Now we have the start of a feedback loop where the parent is saying, this is a child who doesn't want me to touch them, and then cries like crazy, which eventually becomes, as Stephen Porges says, my baby doesn't like me. And whether we as parents know what we know, it doesn't matter. We as human beings will react to that in certain ways. And this is something therapists have to watch out for because our clients will miscue us. They'll look away, look down, and our bodies will say, "Oh, they didn't like what I just said." Keep that curiosity eye. What just happened? Nothing. What are you talking about? Oh, and maybe this is a sensory threshold issue, right? So we have to be really careful with those miscues. Does that make sense?
Totally. And I mean, again, important to hear that we're talking about not only therapy as a actual process, we're talking about the therapeutic. That is what every human being is meant to engage on behalf of others. And especially as we talk about a mother and a child, parents and a child, siblings and a child. I mean, we've got enough data to know that literally 1 out of every 2 people with ADHD has also a struggle with dyslexia or dyspraxia. And so already, if you're in that 15%, and again, that's a generalized term, but if you're in that unique set of people who experience the world differently because your brain is organized in a different way, we're not talking about a defect. And I think that's where the neurotypical tend to look at people who are neurodivergent. And there is shame. And I mean, even for me to be able to name, oh, no, wait a minute, you are certainly neurodivergent. Now, looking at that in part came because many of my grandchildren struggle with dyslexia. Some of the same have issues already of ADHD. And the several that I'm thinking about, and I'm not going to go into detail, but they are freaking brilliant in how they see, organize, speak. Some of the drawings that I have from several of my grandchildren that were about 5 or 6 or 7, they're brilliant, and from one sense, they're sellable. I'm keeping them for my retirement. So we can begin to address the fact that everyone in the world listening to this podcast has someone in their world, be it a son, daughter, grandchild, spouse, friends, who operate within that neurodivergence. But let me just take us back to why is there such a struggle between neurodivergent and often those who are referred to as neurotypical?
I would say the main things are the early childhood experience of people with neurodivergences, especially what I call notable ones, which is if you walk through the grocery store and interact with people, people notice. Okay. They have had a very consistent experience of essentially people telling them they're bad and they're wrong. And it's a situation where the child is consistently being asked to do something that they literally cannot do. And this leaves a lot of shame, as you were mentioning, but also can lead either to acting out like crazy because they're trying to get what they need. I can't communicate this, I'm trying, or a total shutdown. Now, it's interesting when we talk about this because there are some crossovers with, what we call coding in racial minorities. But this is much more traumatic because their entire community is saying the same thing about them. So what neurodivergents tend to develop is what we call masking. And because everyone has asked them when they are really dysregulated inside to not act dysregulated, but act pro-social. The problem is you're asking a neurology of a child to act as if everything's fine and I can do this thing, which they cannot do, while inside they're just freaking out. Okay? That's what masking is. It's quite a different thing, and it takes, as you might imagine, an enormous amount of energy. And I would call it's on the level of a split if we're talking about psychotherapy. It's just a huge thing that they have had to do. And that's what needs to gradually soften. But where's the community that's going to promote that?
You mentioned that you work with a lot of folks who are newly diagnosed. And what we know, or what I've heard people say, is that like it's not like neurodivergency comes on like later in life. It's something you're born with. So that's a lot of time to be navigating a world without the awareness of why and how there have been these miscues, why and how you felt such isolation and shame. And I'm just curious, from your experience, and I might be asking for a friend. It was one of my goals this year to actually get some neuropsych evaluations done. I had a baby at 40, and I'm in that place of like, is this just like postpartum? Is this perimenopause? Or is there something else going on here? And so, I'm asking for a friend about if there are some presenting things that people come in with. Is it this new diagnosis that's driving people to do more work, to make sense of their world, to get a different kind of attunement, to get healing? Or is it just that you specialize in this, so people are seeking you out because they know you might have a greater awareness and attunement for who they are?
Well, fortunately and unfortunately, I get a lot of referrals from the psychologists in town that do neuropsychs. Okay. But what do people come to me for? They probably had some inkling, right? But then they got the diagnosis, and now they have what I would call an immense neurodivergent identity crisis.
Mm.
How do I make sense of what has been? And that's what makes NFTC StoryWorks so good for them. Because I can use the neuropsych information and develop some information with clients about their sensory motor system. That's helpful to know the underneath of it, but then also to go back into their stories and help them understand what their experience was. And that takes some understanding of their system, but also they're having to reassess in a deeper way than most people do. Oh, my mother reacted to me this way in anger because she was frustrated and didn't know what to do with me. But also, every time she pushed me away emotionally, I didn't have anyone else to go to, and I didn't have anyone who understood me. And then it happened with peers, and it happened at school, and it happened with the teachers and the coaches and everybody, down to the barista. And they have this sense of, I'm a bad person. I'm a defective person. I'm a person who can't. And that is a lot to dig through, as you might imagine.
Well, and I'm thinking particularly of some of the privileges I've had to work with folks, for example, who had dyslexia. And some of the most brilliant men and women who, in some ways, have developed through memory, through the capacity to memorize, to hold levels of data that make my brain just feel like it's functioning on one cylinder compared to their 12. And to go back and to be able to say, when we see this as deficiency, as something wrong, we really exclude the uniqueness of how a neurodivergent person comes into the world and offers a way of thinking, a way of seeing, a way of engaging beauty and complexity in ways that, again, we do tend to isolate, judge, and in many ways require that person to be other than who they are, which back to the word masking and to code in a way in which you're trying to fit in, but at some level you can never do so. It does create both trauma, but also, and I'm not trying to put a lovely little silver lining around this, but it does create a remarkable way of looking at the world. At least that's been the experience I've had privileged to be able to work with folks who are neurodivergent. Do you find that to be true?
Oh, 100%. They are, each person is so adept in ways that we're not used to seeing, but because they've had to cope with the world, and I mean the sensory environment too. One of the neatest examples I've seen of this is, I have a dear friend who's Native American, and her particular clan was the clan that went out in front scouting and in reverse, like behind the tribe when it was moving, to make sure there were no attackers, nobody's following. Everyone in this clan has ADHD, hyperfocus. Why? Because they're looking and looking and looking and looking. They're not getting stuck on one thing. They're just looking and looking and looking. And it is a skill, and their neurology allows them to do this really well. So that's just an example of for the purpose of being in that tribe, they have a clan that is very skilled and neurologically adept at doing something useful for everyone else. If we had the ability to look at every neurodivergent person like this, we'd be making huge strides towards um, understanding them and giving them the place that they deserve.
I love that. And I was reading the other day, even that in a lot of indigenous communities, there's not like they don't talk about autism and ADHD in the same ways, right? Like it's not set aside as like a medical designator. But yeah, like I hear this a lot with certain friends and colleagues who are getting later diagnosed later in life, who have done a lot of story work and trauma work. And I think you were putting words to this. And it's that question of like, are some of these particularities of me or nuances of me, are they trauma? Is it because of trauma? Is it because of my neurodivergence? Is it a collision of the two? Is it a compounding of the two? And I would be curious, kind of as you bring narrative focused trauma care and neurodivergency frames together, like how do people begin to parse out where like certain idiosyncrasies like anxiety, depression, like how do we make sense, in some ways of these symptomologies? Because so much of the work, I think, of healing is just having awareness of who you are and how you perceive the world and what would be kind ways to like, yeah, have a different sense of identity and sense of self, but also different tools and skills, to know what your capacity is and to know what will, in some ways, could be transformed as opposed to what might be, something that you're working with for a lifetime. So I would just love kind of your insights there and working with folks.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And so the way I usually start therapy with people, because they usually come in with a neuropsych or their kid has one, is let's talk about your own sensory system. How does it work? So we actually do a profile, and then same with the motor system. Let's understand ourselves. And I actually throw myself into the mix, which the DIR model actually does. Here's the therapist's profile. How are we different? So you begin to form like community of two, where the two of you are talking very differently about who you are. And from that understanding, you help them go out into the world and watch that have its effect. For example, somebody who has very sensitive auditory processing issues and maybe threshold issues, they walk into Walmart and immediately they can't do it. Okay. So what if we walked to the door of Walmart and noted all the sounds and watched where they're coming from? We look. You've heard this in trauma situations. They have massive trauma that's just from the world impinging on them in sensory ways. So we walk through, well, what is it like to encounter another person who looks at you 3 times because they're not reading you? There's a lot of shame that comes up. What if you engaged it directly? This is much later. What if you said, hi, like, I notice that you're wondering about me. Is there something you want to ask? That takes a lot of gumption, of course, for someone who's been traumatized a lot, but the step is so powerful they realize most people really are fine with it. They're just trying to get their read socially, and they're having a hard time doing it. And then they discover the other person has shame about not being able to do that. Oh, that's a game changer. So we're trying to work at that level, but then also at story, going down and figuring out, well, what was it like when you went to kindergarten and you realized that your social processing was so slow? What do we do with that? Oh, that's why the kids didn't like me. Oh, so much grief there, so much grief about that. But getting at that grief is actually easier than working with most traumatized people because once people with neurodivergences get the idea of what was happening, it's almost like, what's that card game where you line up all the cards, or dominoes? It's like dominoes. They just start going down, and they'll come back in the next session and go, what? Oh, now I get why this and this and this is happening. Right? It's very beautiful to watch.
Oh, it's such a gorgeous picture again of what happens when we can make sense of what seems to be such insensibility, so different from how others engage. And so to come back to this question, because, one of the things that even without having the language for myself of neurodivergence, it has been a marital issue for decades. I just began a week or so ago reading a biography of Blaise Pascal, which I brought out my English version of the Pensées, my French version of the Pensées, and I set up my wall of, shall we say, reading. And Becky started laughing. And she was like, well, when will I see you again? And I'm like, what do you mean? She said, it is clear by how you're creating, in some sense, almost a shelter. You've got notebooks, you've got your Remarkable out. It literally is. It's like you're going into a realm where I haven't seen you do this like in at least 6 months or so. So I'm just wondering when you're going to be coming out of your cave. So having the language of what she's naming is hyperfocus ADD, neurodivergence, entering into a realm where, as she would put it, you live so much in your head. That would have been a very offensive remark 30 years ago. But through a long, shall we say, arduous process for her, but for both of us to engage, how do you help couples begin that process? How do you help a person own and begin with, especially if they're married to a neurotypical spouse, how they begin to process this? Because part of the complexity, again, is if you're in that 15%, the 85%, we didn't have language. My mom and dad didn't have language. The teachers who entirely saw me to be a problem in the classroom didn't have language. And even today, one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is to, again, acquaint people with the reality, but particularly if they're in a marriage, it brings complications.
It certainly does. On the other hand, the spouse is coming in with, usually these are parents in my realm, but the spouse is coming in with some big question marks themselves, and also maybe some judgments about what is happening. And so, to have a somewhat, if we can say, a simple answer, actually creates a sense of relief in them. Like, oh, it wasn't all directed at me. Oh, it wasn't a problem with the relationship, really. They're struggling with something here. And so I always work with them if I can in a couple, because the normie part of that couple, assuming there is one, yeah, assuming there is one, because some of them, that's not true, is watching me work and try to figure out what's going on under the surface here. And light bulbs are coming on in their heads, right? So to turn to them and say, does this make sense to you? They're almost speechless with, yes. And here's a whole bunch of other things I see that fall into those types of categories of behavior or social response. And so it's actually a very beautiful way. You have an observer who's very internal to the process for this person, um, and someone who's supportive. Usually, by the time they have gone through the sensory profile and understand how this affects their social processing, the spouse is like, "Oh, this explains a lot," and then they can work on it together, and they have their own trauma stories together because of not knowing what this is and what to do with it. And again, being in your trauma-informed couples therapy is helpful to apply the story work to the couple as well.
Again, thank you. So, as you think through this, Stephanie, in terms of where a believing community can, shall we say, take a step when we begin to talk about like maturing and the process of growing. So often, I don't know how to put it better, but it feels like there's a one size fits all. And already what we're saying is when you perceive the world, when you experience your body, and again, a question that you brought up, Rachel, a while back is how do we understand neurodivergence? Because again, we don't have a fundamental beginning point to say that it is merely trauma and or merely the difference in terms of how a brain's configured in the womb and through the process of birth. So all we can say is there's always going to be an intersection of heartbreak, trauma, and something that is a biological set. For example, what I know with regard to hyperfocus ADD, it's a very different way of metabolizing dopamine. In other words, it takes a whole lot of something intriguing to capture me. And then once I'm captured, there is a primary sense in which reading a book for 8 hours is not only no difficulty, it's more like, and other people don't do that? Well, how do you read a book and put it down in 30 minutes? You don't know what the next page holds.
I don't know
How?
either. Don't know. How do they do that?
So as you think about, particularly, Stephanie, your own work, your own body, your own experience, what do you hope for your believing community and for those listening today?
Well, first, differentiating ourselves from the culture, uh, really in a big way. This is what neurodivergent kids will help us do if we put them first or in the center as they should be, as some of the more needy of us. Children are all needy, and they are particularly needy of us really paying attention to what goes on. So to differentiate from the culture, whose response is applied behavior analysis, ABA therapy, and the culture wants to force those children to be like everyone else. And that is such a massive invalidation of who they are. And it's so consistent. I mean, some kids get ABA for 8 hours a day for years. And I have had the privilege of working with some people like that, and their ability to even know what they want, because everything has been imposed on them. It's heartbreaking what has been done to them. So differentiating from that as a community of believers is super important. We must not force people to be who they are not. And that goes all the way from, "Mommy, I'm afraid to go into this room because it's overwhelming to me," all the way to like, "I just can't understand Jesus the way you're presenting him. He doesn't make sense to me." And everything in between. We mustn't force people to be who they are not.
Again, thank you. I love that. Again, because I've underscored without going into great detail, but all three of my children and their spouses are dealing with neurodivergent children. And in some sense, as I look at my children, their own neurodivergence, and to begin to say what I have seen for all of my children and their spouses is the cost is so high because the expectations of the larger culture, the school system, the church, and everything around it is so binding that to, in one sense, break out of that mold feels like you're literally creating a demand for the world to see difference. And we hate difference. At least in the context of
We
most
do.
people's lives, especially when that difference requires you to parent differently or to have to question, wait a minute, what I would normally do doesn't seem to be working. Am I going to blame myself? Am I going to blame my child versus saying it requires a new way of engaging? But what I've seen is so beautiful, and that is who my own children are becoming as they deal with the complexities, the patience, the ownership of
Yes.
their own lack of patience, the humility to face their failures as parents. In some sense of the word, it has called our whole family into a level of humility and humanity that, in some sense, at one level, I wish we were, quote unquote, all normal. On the other hand, I am really grateful. I'll put it in this very particular way. I'm really grateful for the artwork that I have available as a result of my children and grandchildren seeing the world differently. Before we end, again, Rachel, I'm curious about what you're now thinking regarding this friend that you've been worried about.
Well, I will say I've been really grateful to have good friends who have let me in on some of their journey. It doesn't feel as daunting. Um, and I do just have a growing curiosity around ways that we get labeled, right? Like, oh, this person's an introvert, or, they're just anxious, because that's the anxiety piece is one that's just, and I can make sense of a lot of my anxiety if I have a trauma frame. But there's some of the anxiety and like overstimulation that I'm dealing with that like feels like it might be coming from like a different category. And instead of being like, we just need to work harder, we just need to work harder. I think I'm getting older and I'm tired. And
Yeah.
I don't have the same capacity to just power through, and it has impact on the people I love. And so, yeah, I actually feel a lot of tenderness toward myself. Again, more curiosity. And I'm just aware of this is such a fraught place because of everything we put words to. Like, for you naming this as like, it is its own kind of attachment trauma, attachment wound. It's its own kind of societal wound. And there is a spectrum. So I know there are folks listening going, you guys are touching on some of what I deal with or what I deal with as a parent, but like, it's, there's a severity or there's such a barrier or, so I'm aware of how much heartache there is because of our really like our individualistic society, right? And the lack of resourcing and the lack of, that kind of capacity, even like, let's say as a believing community to say, okay, we're going to let things get a little messier or more accessible. And accessibility requires nuance and it requires creativity and, it requires sometimes really messing with our neat uniform infrastructure. And so I do feel a lot of compassion and I think some just some of the feelings of injustice for what people have had to endure. And so I'm grateful, Stephanie, for I feel like you have a very playful, very generous presence and very wise presence. And so I think your presence and posture has invited me to a deeper curiosity and humanity and tenderness. And I feel really grateful for that.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah. And I would just say to people out there who are parenting, I know there's a great deal of heartache in this. And also, there's such opportunity. You have worked very hard. There are ways that your hard work is forming yourself as well as your child. Keep going. And if you have friends or you yourself are neurodivergent, you do need your community to tell you you're all right. Just be curious about yourself. Be more curious.
And let the gifting that your way of seeing the world be, in some sense of the word, a prophetic gift that allows for other ways to be, as well as other ways to see. And as we begin to see that, the gospel is a kaleidoscope. And in those multiple colors, but also in a slight shift, the multiple perspectives those forms and colors bring really is meant to hold us, not merely to struggle or to difference, but something of the multifaceted glory of God. And easy to say that. I know the struggles, and I know the struggles that a parent, a spouse, and others will feel in this. But you've underscored, get more data, open your heart. Don't just shut down with condemnation of yourself or the other, but allow this growing gift of curiosity to be what propels you into the more. So, Stephanie, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I was very pleased to do this. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Clay Clayton, and I get to do the fun job of helping people connect with the Allender Center at the Seattle School. As a listener of the Allender Center podcast, you know it's all about equipping, encouraging, and inspiring people just like you who are passionate about understanding trauma and fostering healing. Every month, tens of thousands of listeners, therapists, pastors, nonprofit leaders, and everyday people tune in to learn and engage. We're now inviting a select number of mission-aligned organizations to sponsor the Allender Center podcast. By partnering with us, you'll help the podcast continue growing, reach more listeners, and spark new conversations that make a difference. Sponsorship perks can include ad placements right on the podcast, recognition on our website and social media, and even opportunities to connect directly with our audience through special features. To learn more about how you can partner with us, you can contact me directly at cclayton@theallendercenter.org. You can also find my contact information in the show notes. Together, let's make an impact.
Allender Center Podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.